So first of all, welcome to Thailand, and I believe it's going to be a great trip for you, right?
It's already been a fantastic trip. I've been working with the embassy to have some wonderful meetings with some really fascinating people, journalists, human rights activists, all sorts of amazing characters. So it's been a real honour and a privilege to be a part of it. And I love this town. I always love coming to Bangkok.
And first of all, you've reported for the BBC, Reuters, Al Jazeera, but your detention in Egypt actually made global headlines. That was over 10 years ago, right? So how did that experience reshape your view about press freedom?
Yeah, so that happened back in 2013 when I was arrested. And what happened then was that I was working, as you said, for Al Jazeera, covering the unfolding political crisis in Egypt. We saw ongoing street protests between rival supporters. One group was supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood that had been ousted from power in a military coup a few months previously. And then there were the supporters of the military-backed government that were already in there. And we'd been doing what we thought was legitimate journalism, just reporting from both sides of the crisis. But the interim government had started accusing the Muslim Brotherhood of being involved in terrorism. And so by talking to the Brotherhood and their supporters and broadcasting their views, even though there was nothing inciting about it, they weren't calling for violence, at least not in our interviews, we're accused of broadcasting terrorist ideology and being part of a terrorist conspiracy. That experience made me reflect very deeply about whether or not what happened to us was just a one-off, just an isolated example of a government coming after journalists using national security legislation. But the more I thought about it and the more I reflected on my own career, which goes back to the early 1990s, I realised that, in fact, what was happening what happened to us was part of a global trend that really began in 2001 after 9/11. Back then, when George W. Bush declared the war on terror after the 9/11 attacks, what he effectively did was declare a war on an abstract noun, on an idea. And we saw this battle between Islamic conservative Islamic ideas of Islamic utopia, militant utopia, on the one hand, and ideas of Western liberal democracy on the other. And this is a really unusual shift. Most of the times, even the Cold War was really about a battle between two neo-colonial powers. But this was the first time we'd really seen that war of ideas. And in that war of ideas, the space where ideas are transmitted becomes, by definition, a part of the battlefield. And that's not an abstract idea. What happened to us was a really visceral example of the way in which, as I said, government had used national security laws and laws around terrorism to lock up and to silence uncomfortable journalism. The more I looked at it, the more I realised that trend had pretty much continued since 9/11 all the way through. And even today, we're seeing journalists imprisoned at record rates around the world. Close, I think it's over 350, 360 at the last count. And even that count is relatively conservative. But here's the thing, that the Committee for the Protection of Journalists, which is based in New York, has done an analysis of the charges that journalists are facing. And they found that around 2/3 to 3/4 of those journalists who are in prison are there on what they describe as anti-state charges. So that's things like sedition, treason, threats to national security, and, as happened to us, terrorism. But you asked how my understanding shifted, and that's really the answer. I started to recognise the ways in which governments had used the war on terror and national security and the changing rhetoric around that, and used it to increasingly see journalists as part of the problem, as a threat to national security and stability, which is completely perverse.
Right, and looking back at that particular incident, it actually triggered a huge movement that journalism is not a crime. So how does it feel to know that this particular incident has created such a global momentum?
Yeah, it's interesting you raised that, because at the time I was in prison, we didn't realise just how big the campaign had become. I'm so gratified by the support that we got from our professional colleagues around the world, from journalists and members of the public and human rights activists. In fact, I was at the Foreign Correspondents Club, the Thailand Foreign Correspondents Club, and there I saw a photograph, a montage of photographs that the Foreign Correspondents Club had put together of all of the journalists and cameramen, photographers with their mouths taped shut as a part of that campaign. Now I understand how big that became and how significant a movement it was. It's really unusual. It's one of the problems with journalists is that we're very difficult to organise. We very rarely collaborate together on a campaign. Ours, for some reasons that I don't really understand, became a real touchstone. I think part of it was because we made it very clear. I smuggled a couple of letters out of prison saying very clearly that we have not been imprisoned for anything we've done, but because of what we represent, and that was press freedom, that the Egyptian authorities were trying to come after journalists as trying to threaten and silence press freedom. And I think a lot of other journalists around the world recognised that, saw the injustice of it, and decided that they also needed to get involved, because in a way we were representing all journalists that have been threatened or at risk of being silenced.
And over the course of your career, would it be fair to say that press freedom is deteriorating?
Yeah, I think so. 9/11 really was the turning point. And if you have a look at the graphs that show the numbers of journalists imprisoned, the numbers of journalists who've been killed on the job for their work, both those graphs show the numbers steadily increasing after 9/11. To the point where both are around record highs at the moment. The numbers of journalists being murdered dipped a little bit, but they're now, particularly thanks to the war in Gaza and in Lebanon, we're seeing terrible numbers of journalists being murdered for their work. And so the numbers are back up there. And so those two simple statistics, journalists in prison, journalists murdered, now at record highs, I think is a very clear indicator of what's going on.
And with the increasing conflicts around the world, we're seeing more journalists being imprisoned and being killed, especially in the conflict zones, for example, in Russia and Ukraine, in the Middle East, and also in nearby countries like Myanmar. So what does it really say about the vulnerability of journalists working in this era?
I worry that we've lost a lot of the public trust in journalism. Part of that is the responsibility of journalists themselves. We've allowed our ethics and standards to fall in the rush to try and get eyeballs and revenue and to keep going as a business, to keep the money coming in. But I think, and that I think has meant, the reason I mention that is because I think it's led to a loss of public pressure on protecting journalists and journalism. We've seen a loss of trust and confidence in journalism because of the slide in standards, but also because of the amount of misinformation that we see online. And so I think we are seeing a deterioration in public support and a loss of public understanding in the really vital work that journalists play, the role that journalists perform in a properly functioning democracy. That, I think, is a really serious problem, and we are not making that case strong enough to our readers and our audiences to really remind them that a world without journalism is a really pretty unpleasant place.
You just mentioned democracy here, which I think is a key word here, but in some democratic countries like the United States, we have seen that there is mounting pressure against the public media and also journalists alike, because we've been hearing stories about cutting funds and political attacks against journalists a lot more. So why is journalism being so vulnerable, even in countries like the US now?
Well, yeah, I mean, the US is the famous bastion of the First Amendment, that storied amendment that protects or guarantees freedom of the press and freedom of speech. And yet we are seeing, as you mentioned, unprecedented attacks on journalism. Not just political attacks. I mean, the Trump administration has threatened to withdraw the broadcasting licenses of news organisations that are overly critical. We've seen the Pentagon refusing access to journalists. We've seen the withdrawal of USAID money in support of Voice of America and support of Radio Free Asia and a whole bunch of really vital broadcast and public broadcast services around the world. So I really worry about that. I worry about the message that it sends. I think it's happening because the Trump administration sees free journalism as a threat, as something that undermines, if not democracy, then certainly their administration. But here's the thing: I think it's a real mistake to see journalism as a threat to democracy. If anything, it's a vital part of it. We're often, it's funny, in discussions with politicians, I'm often asked how we balance press freedom and national security. But that implies that it's a zero-sum binary, that if you have more of one, you must necessarily have less of the other. That press freedom and national security, sort of the stability of the state, are things that are opposed to one another. That is not the case. There is a necessary tension between those two things, but journalism, good journalism, keeps the system functioning well. It keeps it honest. Good journalism is the reason that we have elections that operate. It's the reason that people learn about. It's the way that people learn about the policies of the various politicians that they're voting for. It's the way that we can make sure that the state exercises its power responsibly. It's the mechanism that actually keeps democracy functioning. And if we lose that, then we end up in autocratic and authoritarian states. And we know that when that happens, you end up with increase in corruption, you end up with increase in increasing abuses of human rights, you end up with hoarding of power, you end up with all sorts of things which are contrary to the functioning of a good, healthy democracy.
Right, and looking back at Thailand, and recently there has been a case where they have launched information operations to silence journalists as well. So from your perspective, how threatening is the situation?
Look, I'm not an expert on media freedom in Thailand. I've just been meeting some journalists and we've been talking about the situation here. But I think I go back to the point that I was making earlier. I know that the journalists here are under a lot of pressure, but at the same time, I think that in preventing journalists from covering and talking about key issues, you end up damaging the very system that you're trying to protect. It's not always comfortable. It's not always particularly pretty. But one of the key lessons from democracies around the world throughout history has always been that if journalism is free and allowed to operate freely and aggressively, the system works better. It's healthier, it's more stable, it's less corrupt, and it works better for the people. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind and keep emphasizing.
Right, and how should newsrooms respond when these attacks are increasing, especially in the world of fake news, misinformation, and information operations against journalists?
Okay, so there are a couple of things. First of all, I think that it's really important for journalists to respond, to uphold ethics and standards. There's a tendency when this stuff happens for us to allow our ethics to slip. It's very, very difficult when what we're trying to do is to keep the newsrooms open, to keep enough money coming in to survive. But you've got to hold that line, particularly if we're going to hold on to the public support, the social license that we need to operate. We also need to coordinate and collaborate more. Journalists are famously difficult to organise. We don't like collaborating together. It's a very difficult thing to achieve. but I think we need to do that, because I think if there's one lesson from my experience is that coordinated collective action actually works. But we also need to repeatedly make the case that our work, when we're allowed to operate freely and with integrity and professionalism, is as I keep banging on, is essential to the way that a healthy society operates. It's not always an easy argument to make. Politicians don't always like the way that journalists work, and they're often very, very happy to use whatever tools they can to silence journalists, or at least make them compliant. But it's when we're noisy, when we're shouty, when we're the awkward squad, that's when we're doing our jobs.
Right, and of the major threats facing journalism today, whether it's the political attacks, the disinformation campaigns, economic pressure, or even the increase of AI, which one do you see as the most dangerous?
It's such a difficult question to answer. There's a tendency to say all of the above, which is a bit of a cop-out. I think mis and disinformation is a serious challenge, but a lot of that is also driven by AI. I would say the financial threat to the industry, because it doesn't matter what else is going on. If we don't have the money, if we don't have the resources to invest in good journalism, then everything else falls apart. You can't even begin to address the question of AI. You can't push back on mis and disinformation, the loss of public trust, government pressure. It all boils down to the money. And I'm not saying that journalists need to be greedy. In fact, nobody becomes, I'm sure you'd understand, no one gets into this business for the money. It's a famously difficult industry to survive in. But without enough financial resources, you can't invest in the kind of investigative journalism that we need to be doing. You can't produce journalism that holds to the ethical lines when you're operating in an environment that privileges speed over accuracy, polemic over serious reporting, sober analysis over shouty commentary. And so if we have enough financial resources as an industry, we can stay professional, we can stay independent, we can stay neutral, we can stay aggressive, we can cover stories that are difficult, we can cover stories that are expensive, we can do the investigations that might not necessarily yield big stories, but from time to time we come up with ones that really need to be told. And so I think ultimately that's probably the single most important and most difficult threat.
And financial threat is a big thing right now, because even big names like CNN or BBC have started laying off their staff as well. So what does it really say about journalism right now when they are facing with this threat like pretty much all the time?
Well, here's the thing. I think we've got to stop thinking of news as a commodity to be bought and sold like hamburgers. If we treat news in that way, then we're going to end up with the digital equivalent of McDonald's. We're going to end up with a product that's not particularly nutritious for anybody. We're going to end up with something that doesn't really help keep the democracy fed with good information. And we need to recognise that there is a vital public interest role that good journalism serves, and we've got to find a way of funding it that makes it independent of either commercial or political pressure. Now, the Australian government is just experimenting with a couple of new laws that take money from, or force the social media companies to make deals with news organisations to replace some of the advertising revenue that they lost in the digital revolution. It's an interesting experiment. I'm not entirely sure that the Australian government has got it right, but at least as a principle, what we're starting to do is recognise that that news organisations are struggling because of the digital revolution, that we need to take money from there and underwrite and support good reporting. And if the way that the Australians have figured are trying now doesn't work, then we need to rethink. But at least we need to recognise that the money has to come from other sources other than commercial, other than through advertising or subscriptions. That model just isn't working. It's not delivering us the news we need.
Right. And looking ahead, how optimistic do you still feel about the future of journalism?
I think in the short term, I'm quite worried. I mean, all the pressures that you just listed earlier, whether it's financial or political or legal or technical, all of these seem to be working against good journalism. But I also, I take the long view. Ever since Grok painted the story of the bison hunt on the wall of a cave somewhere, we've needed people to record the world, the events of the world, and to help us make sense and understand the world that's going on around us. And I'm pretty confident that we will always need those people. We'll need the storytellers, the good journalists. I've been banging on about this stuff for quite a few years now, pretty much since I got out of Egypt, which is 10 years ago now. But it's really only been in the last 6 months or so that I think the conversations that I've been having have started to change. The people recognise that what pours out of their mobile phones isn't very good. They don't like it. They recognise that this isn't working for us. We're addicted to it in the way that children are addicted to sugary foods. We know it's not good for us, but we still can't stop ourselves from consuming it. But even though they find it hard to articulate the problem, they know that this isn't working and we need to change the way things operate. And so I think there is a growing understanding that actually we need journalists who are operating with professionalism and integrity to give us a core of information that we can rely on to understand the world around us. And I think that's a positive sign.
And what would be your final advice to newsrooms around the world who might be listening to you right now?
I think it would be that we need to band together to make the case for journalism's role. We need to make the public understand that primarily we work for you guys, that as a profession our first responsibility is to the public, to give the public good, reliable information, to make the case for our importance in a democracy, because we can't get anywhere without that social license to operate. There is a lot of cynicism within the public, and I get that, I understand it, but at the same time, I invite people to imagine a world without journalists, where we have to rely on the Facebook feeds and the Facebook posts and Twitter feeds of our politicians and government ministers for our understanding of the world around us. And I don't know about you, but I don't particularly like that idea.
Thank you so much for today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
ขอบคุณค่ะ